If I had a magic wand and I could say, John, what's the one thing you wish the reform movement would listen to you about? It's this. The American people do not trust us. I don't think they should. I think we have to earn their trust. The reason they don't trust us is not because they don't support our principles and our values. 70%, 80% support our basic values. Everyone should be able to vote in every taxpayer-funded election. The lack of trust has to do with the fact that we live in a country in which every grain of sand has been politicized. Everything is partisan. When we come to them and we say, hey, we're about changing the system, they don't say, that's great, sign me up. They say, what's your real agenda? Who are you really working for? Are you team red in disguise? Are you team blue in disguise? Are you trying to pull the wool over our eyes and use reform to get people elected that you like? They have all these questions. And you know what? My position is bring it on. That kind of lack of trust is a sign of how serious the American people take democracy reform. And we better earn their trust.
I'm going to come in with a hot question, okay? I'm going to pull any punches here. There were 6 ballot referendums in 6 different states in 2024, all of which sought to change the process of the primary election. Every single one of these failed. I'd love to get your take on what happened, what you would do differently, and where you go from here.
One of the things about open primaries is that voters are very supportive of it abstractly, meaning if they're sitting at home and you call them and you say, do you think that every voter should be able to vote? 70% will say, yeah, I think that. Voters need time to migrate from their abstract support into saying, okay, I'm not only going to vote yes on this, I'm going to tell my spouse, my children, my neighbors, and coworkers to vote yes on it. That's a journey. You and I had a first conversation 6 or 7 months ago. You said this thing that was so simple, and yet I actually felt embarrassed that I'd never thought of it before. You said, why should someone care about reforming the primary if they don't think the primaries are elections that matter? And it was like, wow, we have to change how the American people see primary voting. They don't see it as an election that ordinary people vote in. They see it as where the hardcore activists vote in. And until we change that, we're going to continue to get elected officials that are only responsive to hardcore activists, not to average Americans.
Which I think when you're like a busy person who's raising kids and putting food on the table, democracy is important, but it's kind of nerdy. And I feel like connecting the primary to real life. How does the primary impact the economy? Your job security, your kids' schools, your access to healthcare.
People have to make those connections in ways that are passionate and that are real and that are not hyperbolic.
I would just like to hear John's reflections on those kind of complicating issues that seem to be emerging right and left.
Putting together combinations of reforms in a single campaign that looks great when you're in an academic classroom and you're kind of game theorying and you're saying, oh, wow, won't this be wonderful? And you take it out into the real world and voters are like, what? So part of why I'm advocating, for example, that we should uncouple ranked choice voting and open primaries is not because one is a good policy and one is a bad policy, is that actually when you combine the two, you almost force people to be dishonest about it because it's complicated and it's hard to say what it is in a 30-second commercial, and voters are like, oh, I see.
Again, I'm Russell Daniels, the Digital Communications Director at Open Primaries. Thank you for joining. 2 quick housekeeping things before we get started. One, there will be a Q&A portion in the second half of the Zoom. So if you want to ask a question, that's great. We love questions. Please put your name, your state, and a very brief summary of your question in the chat. You can do that at any point during the call, and we're going to try to get to as many of those as possible. In the second half, we'll call on you. You can unmute yourself and ask your question. And then two, please, again, make sure that you are muted for the entire discussion unless called on. There's a lot of us here, so we want to hear everyone. So thank you so much. With that in mind, I'd like to kick things off. And thank you all again for joining us for our very first Primary Buzz discussion of 2025. And it's a special one. I want to take a minute to introduce both our host and our guests for today. If you come on our calls normally, you've probably noticed that Open Primaries President John Opdycke is usually the host of our Primary Buzz discussions. We decided to kick off 2025, and we thought it might be interesting and helpful to put John in the hot seat and to speak and give expression to where we are as a movement right now, how he sees us building a powerful forward strategy over the next few years. A lot of you know that John is the president of Open Primaries, which he founded back in 2009. But I'm going to take 30 seconds to sort of puff him up, no matter how
I like puffery.
uncomfortable that makes him. He's an activist and a strategist with 30 years experience working in independent, alternative, and reform politics. He's one of the country's most visible and vocal advocates for electoral reform and political independence. Started his career as a fundraiser and researcher for the Rainbow Lobby, which he advocated for ballot access and debate reform in the late 1980s. In 1992, he joined Dr. Lenora Fulani's independent campaign for president as a regional fundraising director. In 94, he participated in the founding of the New York State Independence Party, a state affiliate of the National Reform Party. In 1998, he became the director of development at the Committee for a Unified Independent Party. And in 2001, he helped elect Mike Bloomberg as the first independent mayor of New York City. Like I said, he founded Open Primaries in 2009 and expanded it nationally in 2014. And he's appeared on everything you could think of: Fox News, MSNBC, Al Jazeera, Cheddar TV, PBS, NBC, and has written dozens and dozens of commentary on the subject of independent politics and electoral reform in everything you can think of: USA Today, The Hill, Newsweek. So something that gets left off his political bio often is that he's also a terrific improviser. And he does that in his free time. When finding the perfect person to pair John with for today's discussion, Chloe Akers was on the top of all of our lists here at Open Primaries. She's a fifth generation East Tennessean. Chloe is deeply committed to issues of representation and fairness. She's currently using the skills honed as a trial lawyer, taking a diligent, patient, and detail-oriented approach to finding rational solutions to complex challenges. She's a leader who believes strongly that the vast majority of Tennessee voters want smart solutions to the complex issues facing the state. Several years ago, with a broad group of Tennessee leaders, she launched the Liminal Plan. It was an organization designed to promote policy solutions to divisive issues. However, she soon realized that no amount of issue advocacy would move the needle without truly changing the incentives policymakers face. Building on what the Liminal Plan started, the organization grew into the Best of Tennessee, an organization focused on educating voters about the importance of participating in primary elections and bringing more complexity to political conversation. And Open Primaries has a lot of exciting work that we're cooking up with Chloe and in Tennessee that we hope to share more about soon. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to our host, Chloe Akers, for today's discussion and have her kick things off. Welcome, Chloe.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for having me. I am delighted to be asking questions and not necessarily answering them. This is a first for me. Not really a first because I was a trial attorney. So I am used to asking questions and I'm used to asking leading questions, which I'll try to refrain from, John, but sometimes I
Uh-oh. I'm literally on the hot seat with you.
We're
Okay.
in the seat that many people have very much not enjoyed in the
Right,
history.
right before they go to jail, they get to answer questions from you.
Well, right before, hopefully they don't go to jail.
Okay, right before they're
Okay,
acquitted.
now
Right.
that we've got that clear, I'm going to come in with a hot question. Okay, I'm
Okay.
not going to pull any punches here. So there were there were six ballot referendums in six different states in 2024, all of which sought to change the process of the primary election, some of which also included adoption of ranked choice voting. For those on the call, we're talking Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, South Dakota, to the tune of around $90 million being spent in support of these ballot referendums. Every single one of these failed. Not a single one passed. I'd love to get your take on what happened, what you would do differently, and where you go from here.
Boy, no warm-up questions, huh, Chloe? We're just diving right in. All right. Well, I think that there's some common themes, though each state was very different. And also there was one big victory, which was Washington, D.C., which was not on your list. And I'll talk about why that won and others lost. But so there's a lot of complexity in these states. And I don't want to overgeneralize. Or rather, let me overgeneralize, and I just want people to know I'm overgeneralizing here because there's a lot of nuances in the individual states. I think in general, there was an underappreciation that voters needed a lot more time to kick the tires and process this issue before they were asked to vote yes. One of the things about open primaries is that voters are very supportive of it abstractly, meaning if they're sitting at home and you call them and you say, do you think that every voter should be able to vote in publicly funded, taxpayer funded elections? 70% will say, yeah, I think that. But that's abstract. That's not asking them to vote on a ballot question that has to get worded in certain ways and has certain consequences. And voters need time to migrate from their abstract support, which I think of it as it's very broad but shallow, into saying, okay, I'm not only going to vote yes on this, I'm going to tell my spouse, my children, my neighbors, and coworkers to vote yes on it. That's a journey. And it takes time and it takes conversation that, in an ideal world, takes place before the campaign is even launched. So I think there was an underestimating that you could just launch a campaign based on the fact that the polling looks good. There was a over reliance on 30-second television commercials. 30-second TV commercials don't work great for election reform. They work good for simple issues like raising the minimum wage or medical marijuana that people already know about, they have an opinion about, and you're just like, hey, do you support people being able to smoke pot? Vote yes. Boom. That works in an ad. Hey, do you support an overhaul of the electoral system so that independents get to vote and all voters are treated equally? Not so great in 30 seconds. And a lot of the consultants running the campaigns, they put all the money into 30-second commercials. Why? They get paid. It's one of the things we as a movement have to deal with is that there's a lot of incentives to spend all the money on activities, 30-second commercials that get consultants, they get a commission on it. And we have to deal with that. No, very little money spent on grassroots organizing that would have made a big difference. And then finally, let me just stop here. We kind of underestimated the importance of having not just good message, but good messengers. The trust issue. I mean, again, we're trying to enact reform in a political environment that is unbelievably partisan. I mean, it's partisan morning, noon, and night. Team red, team blue. And they're spending roughly $1 billion a month to convince all of us that if you're on team red, team blue are evil people. If you're on team blue, team red are evil people. We're trying to enact reform, and voters are going to think, like, it's hard to get out of the partisan fly bottle so voters can see you differently and say, oh, that's not team red or team blue. And one of the ways you have to do that is you have to have messengers that aren't just saying the right thing, but they're conveying to people, this is not team red and this is not team blue. And that's very hard to do. And I think overall we underestimated the amount of training and development and coalition building that needed to go on before these campaigns were launched. So those are some top lines. Again, I could talk about each individual state. One final thing. Both the Democratic and Republican parties came out with double-barreled shotguns. This is one of the few issues in America where both parties are unequivocally against what we're doing. Team blue doesn't want it and team red doesn't want it. And people are always confused about that. They're like, well, it doesn't make any sense. It's something we have to really grapple with. The parties don't want this.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Since that's what I'm here for. So a couple questions. I'm been in this primary reform space now, well, indirectly for a couple of years. And one of the questions that immediately came to mind when I learned about this effort in these 6 states to open the primaries, change the way in which they were conducted as a means to increase the people who participate in them, because increasing participation in primaries inevitably leads to government that's more reflective. It decreases polarization, et cetera, et cetera. And so as you know, I live in a state like Tennessee. We already have open partisan primaries here, very similar to states like Ohio, states like Texas, West Virginia, Alabama, Indiana, places that already have open partisan primaries, meaning you can vote in whichever primary you choose as long as you sort of affiliate with the party at the time you pull the ballot. And we still have an abysmal primary turnout rate. So the primaries in Tennessee are open, but we had 14% turnout in 2024. The primaries in Ohio are open, but you had 22% of voters participate in them, but 73% of Ohioans participate in the general. So I'm curious about what lessons may have been learned in terms of, if the goal is increasing participation or allowing for more access, how do you connect the need to, if you just shift the process, if you build it, they will come, yet when it's already been built, they're not coming. Like, how do you square that up? And do you see that reality shaping the way in which open primaries moves forward in the future?
Absolutely. You're so right. And I think it speaks to a number of things. And please, if I just start blathering on, just interrupt me, because I can talk about this question for a long time.
I'm a blatherer myself.
Okay. One, you're 100% right. Most Americans don't think that primary elections are elections in which ordinary people vote. Even when they're open, they're like, oh, well, that's where the party activists vote, not people like me. That's a cultural thing. That's true in closed primary states. That's true in open primary states. It's a cultural issue, not a legal issue. 1. 2, in states like Tennessee and Texas that have an open system, there are efforts to make it unattractive to vote in the primaries. So you know this, in Tennessee, there's a sign at the poll when you go to vote in the primaries. The sign says, only bona fide party members are eligible to vote today. If you are not a bona fide party member, you can be subject to prosecution. I don't know, if I'm on my way to vote in the primary and I see that sign, I might say, nope, I'm not voting today. I don't want to go to jail. That's intimidation. In Texas, here's what it looks like in Texas. When you go to vote in an open primary in Texas, You walk into the polling place, and the person behind the desk says, do you want the Democratic ballot or the Republican ballot? If you want a Republican ballot, you go stand in a line over there. If you want a Democratic ballot, you go stand in a line over there. Everybody knows what ballot you're taking. And there's a lot of places in Texas. I had a friend who went and voted in the primary. While they were waiting in line, 3 people came, were told they had to stand in a line, and said, I don't want people to know what party ballot I'm taking, and left. They went to vote and they left. That was in a 15-minute time frame. So literally, there is even in open primary states, there is a culture of intimidation, vagueness, make you feel a little bit like, why are they invading my privacy? All kinds of ways to make it unattractive. But at core, we have to change how the American people see primary voting. They don't see it as an election that ordinary people vote in. They see it as where the hardcore activists vote in. And until we change that, we're going to continue to get elected officials that are only responsive to hardcore activists, not to average Americans.
Which, my favorite phrase is we have to rebrand the primaries.
Yes, which I love.
Okay, I love that too. So another question I had based on what you were talking about in terms of some of the things you learned, some of the things that went wrong or done well on those 6 referendums. I heard you say, you have this sort of abstract, shallow support, which I think the primary reform space is the best illustration of what that looks like in practice. And you said that even before a campaign starts, you need to start to lay the foundation to what we're talking about now, which is sort of rebranding the primaries. And here's my question. Isn't that, or shouldn't that be a part of the campaign itself? Like, in terms of, like you say, we need to start to engage more people, rebrand the primaries, sort of elevate the discussion and get folks comfortable before the campaign starts. Is there a way to make that part of the campaign? And should that be part of these campaigns?
Yeah, I'm not saying that as like a separate organization doing it. I mean, there's times when you have to formally launch a campaign you have to file with the government. You have to gather signatures. There's things you have to do. You have to introduce a bill. All I'm saying is there's no rule that says that you can't be talking to people before you do the legalistic things that you have to do. And whether that's a separate group or a campaign. I mean, our team in Oklahoma, they just launched a campaign last month. And when I say launched, meaning they actually filed paperwork with the government. But they've spent 10 years writing editorials, driving around the state on a flatbed truck with a big sign, going to minor league baseball games and doing announcements from center field, partnering with elected officials, having forums, endless conversation about not just primary reform, but the relationship between why we want to fix the primaries, what that has to do with Oklahoma. The fact that our education system is 49th out of 50th. The fact that we have the lowest voter turnout in America. The fact they've done this great work of connecting the reform to the actual state of Oklahoma. So it's not an abstraction. And that kind of work is crucial.
That was going to be my next question about...
Before you leave that, though, I have a really important aspect of that also. This is Sarah Smallhouse in Arizona. Campaigns are political activity, and you generally have a 501c4 organization funding a campaign. Education, awareness, building knowledge, generally not affiliated with a political campaign, can be a 501c3 activity,
right.
which is a really big difference when it comes to fundraising.
Yep.
And so that's another really important dimension of all this, is where the money comes to do all of this.
Great point.
Excuse me for interrupting. But
no, it's a great point.
No, no, I think that, as the organization I run has a 501c4, we have a super PAC, we have a PAC, and probably in the not too distant future, we may have a 501c3. And there's, the nature of corporate entities and what each entity allows is critically important to understand because you can execute different strategies through different entities, thereby building on one another to really find success. I think the best organizations have various corporate entities underneath an umbrella to achieve a goal, which I think is incredibly valid. One of the questions that I wanted to ask with regard to connecting issues, connecting what you just described in Oklahoma. So, we all witnessed the 2024 presidential election, such an interesting year in politics. And connecting the need for participation in the primary, the need for better primary processes, the importance of the primary, not just for this overarching idea of democracy, which I think when you're like a busy person who's raising kids and putting food on the table, democracy is important, but it's kind of nerdy. And I feel like connecting the primary to real life. How does the primary impact the economy, your job security, your kids' schools, your access to healthcare? How do you think those connections are going to be kind of in the hierarchy of the campaigns moving forward? And did you see enough of that in the 24 referendum efforts?
No, we didn't do nearly enough. But again, you have to understand, Chloe, when I started open primaries in 2009, I've said this before and I'll say it again. The experience I had was like starting a UFO research organization. Like people looked at me like I was nuts. Like, what are you talking about, primary reform? That's not even a legitimate topic of conversation. What's legitimate is campaign finance reform, gerrymandering, same-day voter registration, ethics reform. Those are legitimate. What you're doing is illegitimate. 15 years later, in some ways, it's a sign of our growth that we lost 6 campaigns. I mean, we even had 6 campaigns to lose.
Yeah.
So I look at this stuff glass half full. It's great that we're now big enough to lose. Before we couldn't even, do anything. I think though that the question of education is an artistic question. Arizona is very different than Oklahoma, is very different than Maryland, is very different than Rhode Island. There's no kind of like academic, rote, kind of technocratic checklist of like, the reason we need to reform the primaries is because blah, 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 blah. No, people have to create a sense of urgency and rationality and connection so that voters know, and you do this better than anybody, Chloe. You're one of the best at it. Hey, the reason why our schools are not keeping pace with national standards. How about the fact that the education committee in the legislature is comprised of elected officials, none of whom faced any competition in the general election? They ran unopposed. And all they care about is satisfying the 7% of people that voted for them in the primary. How about that is why your kid goes to a shitty school? Oh, I didn't know that.
I do love to make those connections between.
But people have to make those connections in ways that are passionate and that are real and that are not hyperbolic, that are not like blaming the cost of eggs on closed primaries. You know what I mean? Like, we don't want to get too ridiculous, but we've got to convince people that, and you've taught me an enormous amount. All the competition is in the primary. That's where all the decisions are made, and we don't vote in the primary. The general election is where everything has already been figured out, except for a handful of high-profile races in a handful of states. Most of us, 90% of us, live in places in the country where the general election is a pure formality. A pure formality. But people don't know that. People have no idea.
I mean, that is my drumbeat, John, as you know. I would love to see the general election be a place of competition. I think as a former trial attorney, I got to see competition at its best because the better my opponent, the better I was, the more likely truth and justice rose up. So competition doesn't scare me. In fact, I think it's kind of a bedrock of democracy in many ways. And so I'd love to see competitive generals. But if we don't have a competitive general, we have a competitive primary. So we're just going to move the electorate into the space where you have competition by just sort of explaining this is the highest stakes election in the state. It's not to say you shouldn't participate in the general, but sort
Right.
of, I guess it's a reorienting for
Yep.
us. The way I look at it is a reorienting of incentives. I want to ask a positive question now because I feel like I've been hitting you. This is all I know how to do is like cross-examine. Washington, D.C. did have some success in this year, and I wanted to get your take on that campaign, what made it successful, what we can learn from their efforts and apply in other places moving forward.
We've had two big wins in cities in the last 4 years. St. Louis in 2020 and Washington, D.C. in 2024. Both won with over 70% of the vote. And you say, okay, what's that about? One, it's a retail environment. You can't run television ads in St. Louis or Washington. It's too small of an environment. And so what you end up doing, but out of necessity, is you go to ground. You go to the farmers markets. You go to the gay pride parades. You go to the door knocking. I mean, Lisa Rice was telling us that she was knocking on doors and there were people, not one or two, lots of people saying, no one's ever knocked on my door before. I've lived here for 42 years. Like, you have to go to ground. And in that context, election reform issues do much better. And it's ironic, the statewide campaigns are much harder to win because you have to rely on television to some point, and television is not a great medium for our issue. But you have to rely on it because you can't door knock in a state like South Dakota or Arizona. You need some television. But I think it also is an indicator that this is where we are as a movement. When we go to the mattresses, when we go to ground, when we invest in the person-to-person contact, when we build quality coalitions of Democrats, Republicans, and independents, and we put in the work, we can get 70% of the vote. When we go to a big statewide campaign where both parties are against us, we're too small at this point. We're kind of like a good minor league baseball player that bats 0 for 7 when we go up to the majors. Doesn't mean we're a bad player. We're still in our growth process. And I think we're going to get there. I really do.
Well, it's 1:30, so we're 30 minutes in. So I'm going to open it up. I have some questions that have come from the chat. And I am going to start with Sarah Smallhouse from Arizona. I'd love to hear your question for John.
Thanks. So another dimension of all of this is there's a lot of other reforms that sort of go hand in hand with open primaries, and they're being bantered about as alternatives or supplements or such as ranked choice voting, such as proportional voting, such as approval voting, such as primaries open primaries with ranked choice voting in the primary versus the general. And I think people are confused. Voters in Arizona were definitely confused, and there were a lot of antics in Arizona. We did not have a referendum. We had a citizens' initiative, and the legislature did everything they could to sow confusion, including referring to the ballot a measure that was 180 degrees different, constitutionalizing partisan primaries. So as we go forward, there's some wisdom that we should really focus on the open primaries component. And I would just like to hear John's reflections on those kind of complicating issues that seem to be emerging right and left.
Yeah, sure, Sarah. I think I have two kind of main thoughts. One is that I'm a big supporter of pursuing lots of different tactics, policies, efforts. I think we should have hundreds of organizations working on dozens of policies. I'm not one of these people that thinks we should all get together and do the same thing. I like that people are working on a million different ideas, even ones that are harebrained. I'm like, go for it. That's good for our country. I think that one of the things, though, that we have to pay much more attention to is putting together combinations of reforms in a single campaign that looks great when you're in an academic classroom and you're kind of game theorying and you're saying, oh, wow, won't this be wonderful? And you take it out into the real world and voters are like, what? It's just, given where we are as a movement, it does too much too soon, and it's putting ourselves in a position where we're going to get punched in the stomach. And people that support what we're doing are going to vote against us. But the other thing, too, that we don't pay enough attention to, and I think this is, if I had a magic wand and I could say, you know, John, what's the one thing you wish the reform movement would listen to you about? It's this. The American people do not trust us. They do not. And I don't think
reformers.
They don't trust the reform movement. And I don't think they should. I think we have to earn their trust. I think, and the reason they don't trust us is not because they don't support our principles and our values. I mean, again, going back to the polling, 70%, 80% support our basic values. Everyone should be able to vote in every taxpayer-funded election. The lack of trust has to do with the fact that we live in a country in which every grain of sand has been politicized. Everything is partisan. It's like, so when we come to them and we say, hey, we're about changing the system, they don't say, that's great, sign me up. They say, what's your real agenda? Who are you really working for? Are you team red in disguise? Are you team blue in disguise? Are you trying to pull the wool over our eyes and use reform to get people elected that you like? They have all these questions. And you know what? My position is bring it on. That kind of lack of trust is a sign of how serious the American people take democracy reform. And we better earn their trust. We better bring our A game and relate to those questions as, I'm so glad you're asking that. Here's what we're doing. So part of why I'm advocating, for example, that we should uncouple ranked choice voting and open primaries is not because one is a good policy and one is a bad policy, is that actually when you combine the two, you almost force people to be dishonest about it because it's complicated and it's hard to say what it is in a 30-second commercial, and voters are like, oh, I see. So this happened in a number of states. You're telling us that this is for open primaries, but really it's for ranked choice voting. I don't trust you. We don't have the guarantee that people are going to trust us. Just because we're reformers and we're good people and we care about the country, that doesn't mean we get a pass. Sure. We have to earn the respect and the trust of the American people. We have to earn it.
This is also a time of general distrust and concern around the elections of our leaders. And I think even what you're saying is magnified even more, just given the current sort of cultural moment we're in. We have Lisa Rice on the call, who I would like to get her take on why the District of Columbia might have been undervalued or isn't mentioned as much in some of these conversations, because I'd love to hear Lisa's question to you, John, and also her thoughts on that.
Hey, Lisa.
Hey, hello, Chloe. We've never met, but hello. So what struck me, Chloe, and I came in a couple minutes late, was I heard, and in all these places it failed, and I was like, "What the hell? We won in DC. What the hell are you talking about?"
I only said
Who's
states,
this woman?
only states. Yeah, I was gonna get to DC. I assure you, I love DC. I worked there for a summer. I promise those were 6 states, not the District of Columbia. Yes.
All right. Understood and heard. There are a couple of things at play here, and one of them is, and I get why people distrust this movement overall. One of this is why are we doing it? And I think the DC example, it reveals a lot about this movement. One of the things it reveals is because the 700,000 people who live in the District of Columbia do not have representation on Capitol Hill, the movement doesn't give a shit about the voters, because we can't do the things on Capitol Hill that many of the drivers of the movement want to have done. Many of the drivers of this movement, and I speak as a person who has been on the board of Unite America since 2017, so I'm not revealing any state secrets here, no pun intended, but I guarantee you that if the District of Columbia was the state of Douglas Commonwealth, we would have had all kinds of people all over us.
Yeah.
But because we didn't, because we speak out of one side of our mouths as a movement, oh, it's a voters first bullshit. It is about what can be done on Capitol Hill, and the 700,000 residents of the District of Columbia have been devalued, and it's a shame. But what it does, and John has described me as, Lisa, you came out swinging. Well, hell yeah, I came out swinging because I had to fight for every single vote. I had to fight for every single dollar. I could not get funding from anyone before we were on the ballot other than Fair Vote. Fair Vote invested in us financially. And I think as a movement, we really need to think about, what are we really trying to do?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one thing I have to say. The other thing I have to say is I do believe that some of the tactics we employed in DC can be extrapolated to states that are spread, geographically spread out, because most of those states will have a certain number, a base number of counties or cities or towns where folks already have natural communities, whether that's in farming, cattle ranching, some other things that naturally draw communities together. Community doesn't always mean city, and those places and those people and those industries, if you will, have some common needs. And if those needs aren't being met by their elected officials, then that is an environment to talk about what these reforms can deliver for those communities. So I'm not so quick to say, oh, it can't be applied across XYZ state. Statewide, no, but there are certain places that there, are dominant industries that have problems with their elected officials because, I don't know, the water bills are too high, or the everything they need, in terms of connectivity doesn't work, or there are a lot of things. But I think sometimes the political scientists think about, oh, this is a solution, but you really have to pair that with an issue that real live people in a community, in a county, in a town, or whatever are having. Once you do that, then it becomes easier. I won't say
Yes.
easy because it's
You're
a
so right.
dogfight, but they have the people will say naturally, oh, oh, wait a minute, if I get a majority, if somebody gets into office put in there by a majority of us, maybe that will change. And you have to throw the data at them all the time. You know, that is one thing that we threw at them all the time. Did you know that 8 out of 11 people who are sitting on the council right now did not receive a majority of the vote in the primary, which is the only vote that matters in DC, the only election that matters? Did you know that so and so is only in there with 23%, so and so is only in there with 28%, so and so is only in there with 35% of the vote? Does that seem fair to you? Got to
Right.
have those numbers in your back pocket, and then okay, I'll cease.
I think no, Lisa, I think that's really interesting. And I live in Tennessee, which is geographically a very long state. And I love this concept of sometimes we limit ourselves to thinking community is geographic. And I think there are many other uniting factors that build community, something we've seen in Tennessee recently. And one of the things you said that I think is so interesting, and John, I'm going to follow on what Lisa said, and then I'm going to ask another question that came up from John in Florida. So just so John in Florida, get ready. But this idea of, I was recently in a call, or I was in a meeting with some product developers from the tech industry, and their perspective was in the tech world, we are not just obsessed with our solution, which is the product. We're obsessed with the user. And I wonder, John, you know, you see so much. This is the solution. This is the solution. This is the solution. The obsession seems to be in this world, the solution, and that we need to have a little bit more obsession with the voters and the communities and learning more about them and their needs. And instead of just pushing a solution into their, you know, without really spending time understanding the problem, which I don't know, Lisa, if I just thought.
I mean, that's so pertinent. I mean, the name of this discussion today is building trust, not better mousetraps. The reform movement obsesses about the better mousetrap. Like, oh, what if we combine nonpartisan primaries with approval voting and then double proportional representation? Like all these game theories.
Right.
And meanwhile, ordinary people are not part of the conversation.
Right.
They're never consulted. They're never, you know, I mean, there was an article. My colleague Jeremy Gruber called me about this yesterday. There's an article in New York City about this effort underway to convince independent voters to join the Democratic Party so they can vote in the primary. And there's literally millions of dollars being spent to get independent voters to join the Democratic Party. And there was a big article about it in a local paper. Did they interview one independent voter? Did they say, how do you feel about this? I mean, can you imagine if there was a big campaign to get Democrats to re-register Republicans in Staten Island? People would be up in arms, like, how dare you? But no, this stuff, the voters are like related to as they're not even part of the story when it comes to the system. And that's what we have to change. If we don't change that, frankly, they're going to keep voting no on all our mousetraps. And I wouldn't blame them.
No, I think that's that's an interesting and a great segue into the next question. Because as a political nerd, I am very intrigued by this next question. And I'm going to hit it to you, John, in Florida, but I will just say, I'm going to ask the question, I'll read it, and then John, if you want to, you know, add a little bit more context here. The Florida state legislature keeps making it more difficult to get citizen ballot initiatives on the ballot. Should we focus more on protecting the citizen ballot initiative process? And I find this to be an important question because in a state like mine, in Tennessee, we do not have a citizen initiated ballot referendum process. And so, you know, that's yet another reason why leveraging our open primaries to sort of increase participation by rebranding is so critical here. But I think the citizen initiated ballot referendum process, from my outside view, is critically linked to the open primaries movement. So, John, if you want to add a little bit more into your question, and then other John, who's our answer, if you want to answer that question. I think that's a fascinating thing to discuss.
Yeah, this is John from Florida. I've been on the Rank the Vote Florida executive team for several years, and the results of those 6 state defeats hit me pretty hard. So I was questioning, it should ranked choice voting really come first? And I was coming around to saying, no, it probably should be open primaries should be the emphasis first. And so I'm now getting more interested in helping with open primaries. But then it occurred to me that, well, really none of this will work at all if we lose our ballot initiative process, because all of these really depend upon successful ballot initiatives. And every so few years in Florida, they change the rules. Now we have 60% required, more signatures required. They keep moving the goalpost. And I'm saying that, if we lose that, the citizen ballot initiative, well, none of these election reforms are going to go very far. So now I'm actually working more on that as a prerequisite to these other reforms.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that's really hard about pushing forward ideas of like, hey, there's a better way to do this, is that there are aspects of our democracy right now that were fought for many years ago to give voters more political power that are under attack, like the initiative process. And it's not the only one. I mean, you look at the partisan control of the redistricting process and their ability to literally just erase competition. Even though we have so little competition in the general election, they want to get rid of any results of it. The parties would rather just not compete. The attacks on the initiative process, the changes in Congress around legislation and who can bring forth legislation, and at the state legislative level. All these things are designed to give the parties and the insiders more power and the voters less power. And we have to resist them and fight them. And you're 100% right. And I think that, it's important that's why I'm a big fan of, we need hundreds of organizations working on specific issues. And we also need to come together as a movement for certain fights around these basic principles and about these basic mechanisms when they occur. And we absolutely need to do that, because no reform by itself is a silver bullet. It just doesn't work that way.
I am now going to switch it to Jen. Okay, this is how I know I'm over 40. Hold on. I can't see small print. Jim Resser in Ohio has a great question about whether the 2024 election cycle, probably in retrospect, was that the wrong year to pursue this type of reform? So I'll let Jim in Ohio sort of add a little more flavor and context to that question, and then John, I'd love your thoughts on that topic. Which, admittedly, let's all be honest here, I don't think anybody could have seen all of the movements and moving parts and changes that went on in this election cycle coming. So as a level set, I think we all have to agree on that. Sure. But Jim, I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions.
I think we might have lost Jim. I think he might have jumped off the call.
Okay, well then, John, I'm just gonna give it to you.
I mean, I don't know. It's always hard to know. If we had won a couple, then it would have been the right year. Sure. I think I did learn afterwards that ballot referendums of any issue tend to do better in a midterm than the presidential. So I think there's probably some validity to that. But let me just play devil's advocate. We learned some really important lessons this year, some really important, painful lessons about, to sum it up, not bringing a knife to a gunfight. And I don't know, maybe it means that going forward, we're going to be in a much better position to win, precisely because we took our lumps in 2024. I'm hoping the Oklahoma campaign wins with 75% of the vote. And we're going to be doing everything that'll be on the ballot in 2026. They have a huge uphill battle. Oklahoma is a very tough state with a very partisan environment, but they're doing all the right things. And I'm hoping that we can show progress in 2026. But I think I don't quite know the answer to the question. And
Sure.
it would have been impossible to see back in 2022, 23.
I agree. I also feel like just most human beings who've been on this planet for enough time might agree with me on this. You learn an awful lot more from failure than you learn from success. And I say this as a former public defender. So we lived our lives and, you learned a lot from losing.
Yes. Yes.
And I think it helps you refine your approach in the future, no doubt. All right, I'm going to go to Tom Mast in Austin, Texas, fellow Southerner, a fellow U-tier. So we'll go to you, Tom. I don't know what the question is, so this is a little bit of a wild card.
Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Chloe. We all know our two parties are complicit in keeping out other parties. They work together to see that there are only two of them, and therefore they, on average, have about a 50% chance of winning. One of the outcomes of that is we tend to have a Congress, both houses of Congress, that are very evenly divided, and that just ends up in a perpetual warfare, generally fighting about parties rather than about what we need as people. So my question, I'll pop two or three out here in a hurry, and then I'll listen to the answers. Does having an open primary that is still a partisan primary, like Texas, really help much? Does it really attract very many voters? Does it really change things very much? Does it get more competition into our primaries? And then question number two, please discuss how important it would be if we were to cause states to be prevented from financing one-party primaries. So that's it.
Yeah, those are great questions. Okay, so does an open partisan primary move the needle in a positive direction? Yes and no. Yes, in that you're creating an opportunity for voters to have more of an impact. And particularly, we saw this in Colorado, when you paired it with vote from home, all of a sudden, all these independent voters were getting a ballot mailed to their home. And they were learning, oh, I get to vote in the primary, because there was a public education component of that. And that just going from a closed primary to an open party primary made a difference in the political culture and outcomes and competition in Colorado. However, if reform is thought of as simply the technical changing of a law, we miss the real change. The law change is one component of it. If you don't go out and educate voters that they can vote in those primaries, as Chloe was saying earlier, it doesn't matter. People don't think they're eligible to vote in them. So it's we as a reform movement, yes, we need to change the laws. We need to run campaigns to give maximal ability, but we need to do so much more than that, Tom. We need to educate the American people that going to vote in a primary is a way they can make a difference for their family and their community and get more political power for average Americans. And that's a huge undertaking for a small movement, but I don't think anything short of that is going to be transformational for the country. Second, what was your second part? Because it was really good. I don't want to miss it.
Well, should states be financing primary, or should the parties do it?
Yeah, we're going to go after that in court. We're already lining some stuff up in Pennsylvania, in Maryland, in other states. We're going to go after the taxpayer funding issue. We tried in New Mexico and we kind of hit a brick wall. The court didn't go against us, but they didn't go for us. They kind of kicked us out of court in a weird way. But that's a very ripe issue, and we're gonna litigate that in the next 24 months.
So John, we only have about 4 minutes left. I see Russell, and I assume he's coming on to tell us we have 4 minutes left.
We have 4 minutes. We have time for one more question. But before we do that, I just wanted to quickly say thank you all for coming on. You will all get an email with a video of today's discussion and any materials discussed. And please be on the lookout. Our February invite will be going out to all of you very soon too. So be prepped for that. And yeah, we have time for one more question before we log off at 3.
John, I want to ask you something kind of following up on two things that Tom said that I think is sort of sums up some of the whole of a lot of the questions we've had. You have the reform movement focusing on changing the laws around how primary elections are held, and finding it difficult to convince people that that's important, and how it matters to their daily lives. What are your thoughts on, and this is a selfish question because
The best kind.
what are your thoughts on saying, okay, what if the reform movement switched gears a bit and instead of changing the process of voting, went in and spent a lot of time and effort to convince more people to vote in already open partisan primaries, and then showed how increasing participation in open partisan primaries leads to a better state government? Just hypothetically speaking, if you were going to do that in Tennessee and say, hey, we had this really dysfunctional state government and we really turned things around in part by increasing primary voter participation, and then going to Arizona and then going to Nevada and then going to South Dakota, and instead of saying, you guys should want this because it's good, saying, hey, look what having this did in a state where they used the primaries as a tool, the primaries as an answer, instead of the primaries as a problem to be solved. What are your thoughts on that shift in this movement moving forward?
I mean, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's both. And I think that, you and I, full disclosure, we've been having some discussions about launching a major new initiative in Tennessee precisely to combine conversations about voting in the open primaries as they exist with, let's start a conversation about a better way to have a primary and do those at the same time. I don't think it's an either or. I think, though, that as a movement, we have been overly focused on opening the primaries and not paying enough attention to how do we get Americans to vote in primaries where they have the right? And we have to do more of that, because a light bulb went off for me when you and I had a first conversation 6 or 7 months ago. You said this thing that was so simple, and yet I actually felt embarrassed that I'd never thought of it before. You said, why should someone care about reforming the primary if they don't think the primaries are elections that matter? Why would they care about reforming them? And it was like, wow, that's like a huge hill. And one of the ways, not the only way, but one of the ways that we can start to change how the American people think about primaries is to say, you can vote in this primary, and it would make a difference. And there's a reason to do that, because come November, all the races have been decided and your voice is not going to be heard. So go vote in March. Go vote in November too, but vote in March, because that's where you can make the biggest difference. And we've got to do both those things.
Well, I know we're at 2:00 right now. I would like to say thank you for having me and allowing me to ask you questions and moderate. And I'm just thrilled to hear all of these interesting takes and insights. So thank you so much to Open Primaries, and to you, John.
Thank you, Chloe. You did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We will see you next month, and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Nice to meet you, Chloe.